Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. And today I'm going to cover a band that actually is pretty legendary, has a pretty high profile, so I don't need to sell anybody on them. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think about their records and their music, and give a lot of history and a lot of fans of Pink Fairies. That's who I'm going to talk about, Pink Fairies. Probably know a lot of the story of the band as they evolved already. I came across them because once again I was going through the cutout bins and there's Kings of Oblivion, and I could tell right away from the cover that I was in for something great. I think it even says to play loud on it, but they looked like they were right up my alley. Three guys, great song titles, really cool cover, and I got it home and I was completely blown away. They instantly became one of my favorite bands of that era, and it wasn't until years later that, as I pointed out in other videos, back then you really didn't know about a lot of imports, particularly because I was a young teenager. So I didn't really know about a lot of import records. So I wasn't aware of Never Neverland and What a Bunch of Sweeties. And so I got those later. And of course, it was Loud too. But so I started with um, Kings of Oblivion, worked my way back. So of course, the Pink Fairies have their roots in the UK Freakbeat band, the Deviants, and the Deviants ended up touring the U.S. and they got bogged down in Vancouver and were stuck in Vancouver for a while. And incidentally, they came to here to my hometown in Seattle and ended up making enough money to get back to the UK. But they ended up splitting with Mick Farren, and so the Deviants were no more. And so Mick Farren returned to the UK and started a alternate version of the Pink Fairies with Peter Took and Twink, and ended up doing some shows under that moniker. But then the core band of the Deviants, Paul Rudolph on guitar, Duncan Sanderson on bass, and Russell Hunter on drums, got back to the UK, and they ended up calling themselves the Pink Fairies. So at one point there was two Pink Fairies, but they're named after a drinking club called Pink Fairies Motorcycle Club and All Star Rock Band. And Twink did a solo album called Think Pink, which apparently was only released in the United States, which is kind of odd, on Sire Records. And of course, the Deviants records were released in the United States as well, on Sire Records as well, early Sire Records. And so these musicians had all kind of worked together before, and that's why Twink ended up in the new Pink Fairies. And so the lineup was Paul Rudolph, Duncan Sanderson, Russell Hunter, and Twink. And that's the band that recorded the first album, Never Neverland. And so Paul signed the band. They did live shows and really impressed a lot of people, including an amazing performance at Glastonbury Fair in 1971. And they were granted a whole side of a record with an epic, nearly 20-minute version of Uncle Harry's Last Freakout, which became one of the staples of their live act. So Polydor signed them, and they released their first single, "The Snake," back with "Do It," which is just an epic coupling. And The Snake was not on any LPs for a long time. Of course, it's available as a bonus track and the like now. But and it had a picture sleeve. A couple different European countries that came out with a picture sleeve. Um, so that did pretty well, and there's a lot of great BBC shows from that era as well. And fortunately, a lot of that's been released now too. So in 1971, they released Never Neverland, and it came in a decorated plastic sleeve with the images on the plastic sleeve and the fold-open cover, and originally limited edition in pink vinyl. So I've never seen that one. That one's impossibly rare, but I have a copy of the one with the cellophane sleeve. And it's a great record. I'm kind of surprised as a debut album that it's not that strong with original material. There's definitely some good songs, but they end up doing more or less a cover of their live set, and they just weren't writers, I think, and that plagued them a little bit with their second album too. What a Bunch of Swedes, that came out in 1972. You would think that especially with Polydor being interested, they just would have been a powerhouse of original material. But it seems like they kind of got in there and smoked a lot of pot and came up with material. And so it's not stellar, but it's still legendary, still wonderful. It's still the Pink Fairies, and I love it. But I'm going to say that it wasn't a stellar packed set of originals on that first record or the second record. And the second record, of course, they do "Walk Don't Run," an incredible version of that, including a vocal chorus to it. And that album too, "What a Bunch of Sweeties" '72, was originally going to be called "Portobello Shuffle," which is one of the songs on the album. And there's a BBC announcer that introduces them and says their new album's coming out called "Portobello Shuffle." For some reason, they changed it to "What a Bunch of Sweeties." And there was a single released off that, oddly enough, a cover of the Beatles, "I Saw Her Standing There," which also came out with a picture sleeve. And so they had some success. They played a lot of great live shows. 1971, a live release of them playing in Finland has been released, and also the Wheelie Festival from '71. And so the album came out in '72, and the single came out, and then Paul Rudolph left, and so he ended up in Hawkwind. And in 1972, briefly, they became another Pink Fairies lineup with Mick Wayne from Junior's Eyes on guitar. And so they released a single in 1972 called "Well, Well, Well," backed with "Hold On." And it's a fun record, but it doesn't have that classic Pink Fairy sound. Paul Rudolph was sorely missed. And Mick Wayne just wasn't that great a fit for the band, and the band itself felt like he wasn't that great a fit. There's actually a BBC show of relative quality with the Mick Wayne lineup, and you can pretty much hear that he wasn't necessarily a great fit for the band. And I'm surprised they didn't continue with Trevor Burton from Move. Trevor Burton would play with the Pink Fairies. Once again, there's some BBC material that has the Paul Rudolph version of the band with Trevor Burton on second guitar. And so I'm not sure why he didn't end up doing it. I didn't see any information on that. But the Mick Wayne lineup, they were recommended Larry Wallace. Larry Wallace joined, so briefly Larry Wallace and Mick Wayne were both in the band. And then Mick Wayne was booted out, and Larry Wallace was the guy. And so Larry Wallace got put in a position where he was the lead of Pink Fairies. He hadn't really been that much of a writer before, and he wrote a bunch of material for their third album, 1973's Kings of Oblivion. And I have to say, Larry Wallace really rose to the occasion because the songs on there are just wonderful. "When's the Fun Begin?" "I Wish I Was a Girl," "City Kids," a classic. And there's a instrumental on there called "Raceway," and apparently it was supposed to be a vocal version. And Polydor quickly rushed the album out while Larry Wallace was on vacation, and he didn't get to add vocals. And so apparently they're responsible for the mix as well. And I've heard Larry Wallace complain about it, but I think the way it's produced is excellent. And the fact that there's all these great Larry Wallace overdubs and his guitar playing is stunning and super loud. The rhythm section had really got exponentially better, and it's just a classic record. There's hints of glam in it, and but it's just a powerhouse rock record. Of course, Motorhead, Larry Wallace in Motorhead, and even Motorhead after Larry Wallace left, they did the classic song "City Kids" off of that album, and it's a true all-time rock classic. And so after the Kings of Oblivion album came out, they toured and apparently just didn't get that great a response, and so they broke up. And then there was a reunion in 1975, and an album that came out a few years later called "Live at the Roundhouse," and it has the full Pink Fairies band with Wallace and Rudolph in the rhythm section. And they did a few shows after that, and still didn't feel like it was really happening. But then they got back together again and signed to Stiff Records. Stiff Records talked him into doing it, and Martin Stone joined the band on guitar, and they released a single, "Spoiling for a Fight in Between the Lines," and they're excellent. It would have been great if an entire Pink Fairies album came out at that point. It was definitely lean and mean compared to the Kings of Oblivion album, but definitely classic Pink Fairies. It would have been well worth it. But that Pink Fairies lineup didn't last, and Larry Wallace ended up doing a solo single called "Police Car" on Stiff, and this was in 1977. And so we have that. And apparently, Larry Wallace recorded a whole album for Stiff, and to this day, it still hasn't been released. So that would certainly be something worth hearing at some point. Then they have kind of continued off and on since then. There's been a bunch of weird material that's come out. There's a Pink Fairies lineup that released recorded in 1982, and it was Larry Wallace, Duncan Sanderson, and a new drummer, George Butler, that was in the Lightning Raiders. And they recorded a record that eventually got released as previously unreleased. And it's pretty solid. Definitely sounds like what the Pink Fairies would have been doing after um, Kings of Oblivion, even though it's 10 years later. But it's pretty solid, well worth hearing. And then 5 years after that, in 1987, Larry Wallace and the Pink Fairies got together again and recorded an album called "Kill 'Em and Eat 'Em." And again, it's pretty solid. Not as killer as original Pink Fairies, but a decent record. Terrible cover, but they obviously got enough of a push. They recorded some live shows in 1987. They did a live show that got released later in 2005, a double record called "Chinese Cowboys." And it's really pretty cool because it's got a lot of Pink Fairies classics on it, and a pretty killer live band. So it's a pretty solid record too, even though it's that much later. And then since then, they've just been one variation of the band after another. I know it involves a lot of the original members sometimes and variations of the original members, but it's definitely a mixed bag, and it's unfortunate. It's great that there's still a lot of interest in the Pink Fairies, but 1996 they came out with Pleasure Island, which is pretty rocking. It's Paul Rudolph is back, and Lucas Fox from Motorhead is on drums, and pretty decent rock record, but I'm not sure if I'd necessarily think of it as a Pink Fairies record. And then oh wait, that's not the one with Paul Rudolph. Sorry, that comes later. That's the Kalkowen or whatever his name was that ended up playing with them back in the 70s. Then 1997, No Picture came out. There was another aborted reunion in 2007 with the original lineup from Kings of Oblivion. Then in 2011, there was another version that had Mick Farron in it again. Then in 2017, there's Naked Radio, and it's okay. Once again, it's not really a classic lineup of Pink Fairies. Paul Rudolph and Larry Wallace are not involved. Then in 2018, they came out with Resident Reptiles. That's the one I was thinking of, where Paul Rudolph came back and the bass player from Hawkwind, Alan Davey, and Lucas Fox from Motorhead. And it's a pretty rocking record, and Paul Rudolph is great, but it just doesn't feel like the Pink Fairies really. But it's a solid record, and I don't blame them for continuing to use the moniker because they're a draw now. They're a known quantity. And then in between 2002, 2018 and 2023, a lot of the original members died. Larry Wallace died, Duncan Sanderson died, Russell Hunter died. So any thoughts of having an original Pink Fairies reunion certainly dashed. And now we have Paul Rudolph once again working with Alan Davey and Lucas Fox, who just came out with yet another new Pink Fairies record. But for my money, That classic stuff, the first three albums, maybe the Live at the Roundhouse, the Chinese Cowboys album's pretty good, and then the Stiff singles, really excellent. So um, just one of the great freakbeat bands in UK history. Um, Definitely into drugs, definitely into playing free shows. And when the Bath Festival started in 1970, Led Zeppelin played on the inside, on the outside of the fence. There was Hawkwind and Pink Fairies, so they were a people's band. And Paul Rudolph's guitar work on those first two albums is just ferocious. He was a monster, and live, as evidenced by records like Live in Finland, they were just huge. Um, but as the live shows show that they didn't have a lot of original material to rely on, and ended up doing a lot of covers. So some of the BBC shows they do Lucille and other classics. But boy, their live sound was huge. It must have been really something to see them in 1971. But yeah, wow, Pink Fairies. I don't need to sell them to anybody, but I'll put a bunch of links below if you don't know the Pink Fairies or you missed out on some of these records. And there's a handful of rarities. I'll post them all below and check them out. Up the Pink Fairies. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.